For my lab report, I decided to research the topic of stress. More specifically, I decided to research whether or not student athletes dealt with more stress than just a regular student. Now, this has been debated in research before, and the big area of debate comes between, student athletes are carrying more on their plates for the most part because they're having to juggle both their academics and athletics, and they've got to learn time management and how to deal with the stress that comes on with having more work. Whereas students, they just mainly focus on their academics and that's all they have to worry about. It's a lot easier to time manage when you have less on your plate. But at the same time, being a student athlete does sometimes mean that you're provided with resources that students don't have, whether it be extra tutors, extra hours in library, whatever it may be. Sometimes there are opportunities for student athletes that students don't usually get. Along with that, student athletes also oftentimes develop coping mechanisms to deal with stress as they play a sport, whether it be that sport is their coping mechanism, that they're able to let out that way in a healthy manner, whereas students don't always learn these coping mechanisms. Now, in a research study that was done by someone else, it was one of my sources, they did research both student athletes and students and how they dealt with their stress. They researched and studied what coping mechanisms each of them used. Student athletes more often turn to exercising to deal with their stress, whereas non-student athletes more oftentimes turn to either music, friends, or family, someone to talk to. Now, I decided to conduct my own research to see whether or not student athletes took on more stress than a regular student. And to do this, I completed a survey and 55 people completed the survey, and I put the survey out via social media. I used my Instagram platform, and it was a very simple survey. The first question was just simply whether or not you're a student athlete, yes or no. And then no matter their answer to the first question, everybody then took the same stress test. I gave them a link and they went to BeMindfulOnline.com where they took a stress test to measure what kind of stress they'd been under. And the way the results work, 0 to 13 is low stress, 14 to 26 is moderate stress, and 27 to 40 is high stress. And after everyone completed the survey, they would give me their score back, and I would be able to put the numbers with what student athlete got this or what non-student athlete got this score. And as soon as I was able to get that, I grabbed all my data so that I had a visual. And after being able to separate all my data, I did have 45 student athletes respond to the survey and 10 non-student athletes respond to the survey. Now, the average stress test score for a student athlete was 19.5, so that falls into that moderate range. And the average test score for a non-student athlete was 20.2, so that also falls into that moderate range. Now, there was only a difference of 7/10 in their averages, so obviously that's not a very big difference at all. And the range of student athletes' scores were between 0 and 34, and the non-student athletes between 8 and 28. So again, both had a pretty large range. There was not a set trend in either of the student athletes or non-student athletes scores, and there was such a big gap in between each of them, and with only 7/10 of a difference, this does lead me to believe that stress in being a student athlete versus a non-athlete are not relatable. They don't correlate in any way. Stress is simply something that everyone deals with individually, and it's not even necessarily just what's going on in your academics and in your athletics. It's not necessarily just about the way you time manage. There's definitely other factors that contribute to your stress. And even if you're not a student athlete and you haven't found those ways to cope the same way as what athletes do, there's definitely other ways to cope, and there's definitely other ways to deal with that. Now, because I did do it on social media, I did reach a limited audience, but I don't feel that my research proved to become invalid because of that. I think it still proved my point that stress is not in any correlation to whether or not you are a student athlete.